I want to ask you something that might be a little uncomfortable. When you step on a scale in the morning and the number is where you want it to be, or at least where it usually is, do you feel reassured? Do you think, okay, I'm fine, nothing to worry about? If you do, I understand that. The scale is one of the most intuitive health tools most people have access to. It's easy, it's immediate, it gives you a number. Numbers feel like information. But I want to tell you today about a study that really stuck with me. Researchers followed 3,000 women, all of normal body weight, all with BMIs that would be classified as healthy, for 13 years. And what they found was that a significant proportion of these women, despite looking perfectly normal by every standard weight metric, were carrying high levels of a very specific and very dangerous type of fat. And those women had a threefold increase in breast cancer risk. Normal weight, normal BMI. 3 times the cancer risk. The scale wasn't just failing to tell the full story. In some ways, it was actively misleading them. That type of fat, the type you can't see, the type no scale will ever measure, the type that doesn't show up as extra weight on your thighs or your arms, is called visceral fat. And today, I want to walk you through what it is, why it's one of the most serious metabolic threats most people have never thought seriously about, and this is the part I genuinely love, exactly what the science says you can do to address it. 7 specific, evidence-based protocols. Let's go. Let me start with a distinction that I think is genuinely important to understand, because without it, the rest of today's conversation won't fully land. Most people, when they think about body fat, are thinking about what we call subcutaneous fat. This is the fat that sits just beneath the skin. It's the soft, pinchable fat on your belly, your hips, your thighs, your arms. It's the fat that changes the shape of your body in the ways you can see in the mirror. Subcutaneous fat is not entirely benign. In very large amounts, it carries its own risks. But it is, broadly speaking, relatively inert from a metabolic standpoint. It sits under the skin, stores energy, and waits. Visceral fat is something categorically different. Visceral fat is fat that accumulates inside the abdominal cavity, not under the skin, but behind the abdominal wall, packed around your internal organs, around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines. And here's the critical distinction. Visceral fat is not a passive storage depot. It is a biologically active tissue. It behaves in many ways like an organ in its own right. It has blood supply, it has metabolic activity, and most importantly for our conversation today, it secretes inflammatory compounds directly into the bloodstream. These inflammatory compounds, cytokines, adipokines, and other signaling molecules pour into the portal vein, which flows directly to the liver. From there, they circulate systemically. They influence insulin sensitivity, driving toward type 2 diabetes. They promote arterial inflammation, contributing to cardiovascular disease. They disrupt hormonal signaling in ways that affect the brain. And they create the kind of systemic inflammatory environment that, as the evidence increasingly shows, creates ideal conditions for cancer to develop and progress. The list of diseases strongly linked to visceral fat accumulation is sobering. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and research suggests at least 14 different types of cancer. 14. Now, the analogy I use with patients to explain how visceral fat causes problems is the suitcase analogy. Imagine your abdominal cavity as a suitcase with a fixed amount of space. When you accumulate visceral fat, you're filling that suitcase. And at a certain point, the suitcase is full. You can't fit anything else in. What happens when a suitcase is overpacked? It starts to burst at the seams. Things spill out. That's precisely what happens with visceral fat when it reaches a critical threshold. It can't expand infinitely. So instead, it begins to spill, releasing its inflammatory chemical load directly into the bloodstream. And that's when the systemic damage really begins. And here's the thing about that cancer connection that I want you to really hold on to. One of the researchers whose work I follow closely uses an analogy about fire. Inflammation, in the context of cancer, is like pouring gasoline on smoldering embers. A small, dormant cluster of cancer cells, the kind we talked about in our episode on the ballpoint pen rule, may be perfectly contained as long as the systemic environment is relatively calm. But introduce chronic, sustained inflammation? That's the gasoline. The embers become a bonfire. Visceral fat is one of the primary sources of that gasoline. Now, here's where I want to circle back to that opening study. Those women had a normal BMI, normal weight. They looked fine by every external measure. But they had a body composition profile, high visceral fat, relatively low lean muscle mass, that is increasingly being referred to by researchers as metabolically obese normal weight, or colloquially as skinny fat. This is why I want you to put down the scale for a second and think differently about what metabolic health actually means. The number on a scale tells you nothing about where your fat is distributed, nothing about how much lean muscle mass you carry, nothing about whether you are metabolically healthy or metabolically at risk. The good news, and this is a theme you'll hear throughout today's episode, is that visceral fat is actually more metabolically responsive than subcutaneous fat. It is more sensitive to the interventions we're going to discuss. It tends to come off faster when you implement the right strategies, which means the problem, while serious, is also one you can meaningfully address. Let's talk about how. All right, I want to start the practical section with something that genuinely surprised me when I first read the research, because it challenges a very common assumption about healthy eating and how much of a good thing you actually need. Most people who are paying attention to their diet and thinking about metabolic health know that omega-3 fatty acids are beneficial. You probably know that oily fish, salmon, mackerel, sardines, are rich in marine omega-3s, specifically EPA and DHA, and that these fats have anti-inflammatory effects that are well established in the literature. What you probably don't know is what researchers in Iceland found when they looked at the dose required to produce meaningful metabolic effects, because the answer is far lower than most people assume. Here's the setup. The study compared groups eating different types of fish 3 times a week over 8 weeks. One group ate oily fish, salmon, which contains roughly 1,500 milligrams of omega-3s per serving, a substantial dose. The salmon group lost about 15 pounds over the study period. Impressive. But here's where it gets interesting. Another group ate cod, white fish, lean fish, not oily at all. Cod contains only about 280 milligrams of omega-3s per serving, less than 20% of the salmon dose. The cod group lost 10 pounds. Not 15, yes, but 10 pounds. From a fish that most people would never think of as a metabolic powerhouse. And the researchers believe the mechanism is the activation of what's called brown fat. Now, most people when they hear fat think of what's technically called white fat, the storage fat we've been talking about. White fat stores energy. It sits there. It waits. Brown fat is completely different. Brown fat is thermogenic. It generates heat by burning fuel. It is essentially a furnace inside your body. Brown fat tissue is densely packed with mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles in cells, and when activated, it burns calories to produce heat rather than storing them as body fat. Infants have significant amounts of brown fat. It's part of how they maintain body temperature in their early weeks of life. Adults have much less, but it doesn't disappear entirely. And critically, brown fat can be activated. The right signals can switch it on. Marine omega-3s, even at low doses, appear to be one of those signals. And the threshold dose, based on this research, is genuinely achievable with very modest amounts of seafood. The researchers estimated that the metabolic threshold, the minimum dose needed to see brown fat activation, can be reached with 4 medium shrimp. That's it. 4 Gulf shrimp contains enough omega-3s to cross the activation threshold, or half a piece of halibut, about the size of half a deck of playing cards, or a single forkful of mackerel or sardines. I want to let that sink in for a moment, because I think there's an important mindset shift embedded in this data. We tend to think about healthy eating in terms of grand overhauls, completely replacing all the fish in your diet with salmon, eating huge servings of expensive oily fish multiple times a week. And that's fine if you enjoy it. But the biology is telling us that the threshold for a meaningful metabolic effect is far lower than that. A single forkful of mackerel on a piece of toast, 4 shrimp in a salad. The metabolic difference between doing that regularly and not doing it at all is evidently quite significant. Start there. You don't have to overhaul your entire diet on day 1. You just have to cross the threshold. Let me explain to you how your metabolic switch works, because once you understand the mechanism, the strategy I'm about to describe will make complete intuitive sense. Your body at any given moment is either in storage mode or burning mode. These two states are largely governed by insulin, the hormone your pancreas releases in response to the carbohydrates and proteins in your food. When you eat, insulin rises, and one of insulin's primary jobs is to load energy from the bloodstream into your cells for immediate use or storage. While insulin is elevated, your body's metabolic priority is to process and store the incoming fuel. It is not burning stored fat. It's too busy handling what just arrived. When you stop eating, insulin begins to fall, and as insulin falls, your metabolism gradually switches tracks, from storage mode to burning mode. It starts drawing on your stored fuel reserves, and one of the primary fuel sources it taps in this state is visceral fat. So, the basic principle of what I call metabolism grooming is simple. By creating a consistent, defined window in which you are not eating, you are deliberately extending the period of time when insulin is low and your metabolism is in fat-burning mode. Now, before anyone hears fasting window and thinks I'm about to describe some extreme dietary protocol, I'm not. This is a 12-hour window, not 16, not 24, 12 hours, which when you look at how most people's days actually run, is entirely achievable without any sense of deprivation. Here's the specific framework I'd like to walk people through. 8 o'clock in the evening, finish dinner, close the kitchen. That's your cutoff. From 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., you're getting 3 hours of low insulin, fat-burning time before you go to sleep. You're not fasting in any extreme sense. You just finished dinner a couple of hours ago. But insulin is already trending down, and your metabolism is beginning its transition. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 8 hours of sleep. And during those 8 hours, your metabolism is running in background mode, drawing on fat stores. Every hour of good sleep is an hour of metabolic recovery and fat metabolism. Sleep is not a metabolic pause. It's when a significant portion of your daily fat burning actually happens. 7 a.m., you wake up. And here's the part that surprises people. You wait 1 hour before eating breakfast. Not because you're supposed to be uncomfortable or because willpower is the point, but because that extra hour extends the fat-burning window by another session of low insulin metabolism. By 8 a.m., you've been in fat-burning mode for 12 consecutive hours. Then you eat breakfast at 8 a.m. Insulin rises, storage mode begins again. But you've secured 12 hours of metabolic advantage that most people simply never access because they're grazing, having a snack at 9 p.m., eating breakfast immediately upon waking, and never giving the switch time to fully flip. There's also a circadian rhythm dimension here that I find particularly interesting. Human metabolism is not a constant process. It follows a daily biological clock. We are, metabolically speaking, more efficient at processing food earlier in the day than later. The same meal eaten at noon has a different metabolic impact than the same meal eaten at 9 p.m. because your insulin sensitivity and digestive efficiency both decline in the evening. By closing the kitchen at 8 p.m. and not reopening it until after a night of sleep and an hour of waking fat burning, you're working with your biological clock rather than against it. You're timing your eating to align with when your metabolism is most capable of handling it effectively. This is not a crash diet. This is not deprivation. This is just understanding how the biological switch works and being intentional about giving it time to do its job. All right, this next section is one that tends to make people very happy because it involves coffee and tea, and the news is good. Let me start with coffee. Researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health ran a clinical trial in which participants consumed 4 cups of coffee daily over 6 months. The results were striking. The coffee group lost an average of 4.6 pounds of body mass over the study period. The control group, the placebo group, who didn't drink coffee, gained 4.4 pounds over the same period. Let me put those two numbers side by side, because I think the divergence is what makes this data land. Coffee drinkers, minus 4.6 pounds. Placebo group, plus 4.4 pounds. That's nearly a 9-pound swing in body mass between two groups whose only significant variable was whether they were drinking coffee. The mechanism is primarily attributed to 2 compounds found in coffee, chlorogenic acid and caffeic acid. These are polyphenols, bioactive plant compounds, and they have several metabolic effects. They improve insulin sensitivity, which means the body handles the same carbohydrate load with a smaller insulin spike. They influence fat metabolism pathways directly, and they appear to specifically act on visceral fat stores rather than just causing generalized weight loss. Now, I want to be clear about what we're talking about here. We're talking about coffee, real brewed coffee, not a large sugary coffee beverage with flavored syrup and whipped cream. The metabolic benefits of chlorogenic and caffeic acid can be easily outweighed by adding significant sugar and saturated fat to the delivery vehicle. Keep it relatively simple, black coffee, or with a modest amount of milk. The compound is in the coffee itself. 4 cups is the dose used in the study. If you're already a coffee drinker, that may be very achievable. If you're more sensitive to caffeine, even 2 or 3 cups may provide meaningful benefit. The dose-response relationship is likely not all or nothing. Now, green tea. Researchers at Isfahan University of Medical Sciences found that 3 cups of green tea per day over 8 weeks led to a 2-pound reduction in body weight. And this is the part that's particularly clinically significant, a reduction of nearly 1 inch in waist circumference. Waist circumference is one of the better proxy measures we have for visceral fat specifically. Losing nearly 1 inch from the waist in 8 weeks with 3 cups of green tea daily is a meaningful finding. And beyond the fat metabolism effects, the green tea group also showed reductions in systolic blood pressure, which is important because one of the major downstream risks of visceral fat accumulation is cardiovascular, elevated blood pressure, arterial stiffness, increased stroke risk. The fact that a simple daily beverage habit is moving these markers in a beneficial direction simultaneously is remarkable. The active compound here is primarily EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate, one of the catechins I've discussed in previous episodes in the context of anti-angiogenesis. EGCG has a broad portfolio of bioactive effects, and visceral fat metabolism appears to be one of them. I'll add one practical note on this. If you want to maximize the catechin content of your green tea, be mindful of water temperature. Boiling water actually degrades some of the more delicate catechins. Ideally, you're brewing green tea at around 80 to 85 degrees Celsius. Hot, but not at a full boil. A good quality loose-leaf green tea or matcha gives you a substantially higher polyphenol concentration than most commercial tea bags. So the morning protocol, at its simplest, might look like this: an 8 a.m. breakfast after your 12-hour window. A cup of brewed coffee or green tea with the meal, another cup mid-morning, another in the early afternoon. You're hitting your therapeutic dose in a way that fits naturally into the rhythm of most people's days. I want to talk about something that most people have in their kitchen right now and are probably not using as a deliberate metabolic tool: apple cider vinegar, or more precisely, the compound that makes vinegar what it is: acetic acid. This is a case where something that's been floating around in folk medicine and wellness circles for decades has now accumulated enough clinical evidence to be worth taking seriously. And I think it's important to discuss it not as a magic bullet, because nothing is, but as one tool in a coherent biological strategy. Here's what the clinical data shows. There is a clear dose-response relationship with vinegar intake and visceral fat reduction. 1 tablespoon of vinegar daily shows measurable benefits, but 3 tablespoons daily shows significantly greater reductions in body fat percentage, waist circumference, and visceral fat specifically. More is better. Up to that 3 tablespoon mark, the dose response is real. The mechanism works through 2 pathways. First, acetic acid directly inhibits adipocyte expansion. It interferes with the ability of existing fat cells to take on more fat and grow larger. Your fat cells are dynamic. They can expand significantly in response to caloric excess. Acetic acid blunts that expansion. Second, and more remarkable, acetic acid appears to interfere with adipogenesis, the creation of new fat cells from stem cells. Your body, under conditions of sustained caloric excess, will actually produce new fat cells from precursor stem cells. Acetic acid impedes that process at a fairly fundamental level. So you're getting a dual blockade. Existing fat cells can't expand as readily, and new fat cells are harder to create. That is a meaningful metabolic intervention from a compound that costs almost nothing and has been used in cooking for thousands of years. Now, a few practical notes. First, always dilute it. Mix 1 tablespoon in a large glass of water, at least 250 milliliters. Neat acetic acid is corrosive to tooth enamel and can irritate the esophagus. Dilution solves both problems completely without reducing the metabolic effect. Second, and this is something I always emphasize, read your labels. If you're using apple cider vinegar, the label should show the ingredient as apple cider vinegar. Full stop. Many commercial apple cider vinegar products, particularly in dressing or supplement form, contain added sugars, corn syrup, artificial preservatives, or other additives that will directly counteract the metabolic benefits of the acetic acid. The beneficial compound and the counterproductive additive are often in the same bottle. The simplest approach: buy plain, unfiltered apple cider vinegar, ideally with the mother, which is the slightly cloudy culture of beneficial bacteria that forms in raw, unfiltered vinegar. Dilute 1 tablespoon in a glass of water. Have it before your largest meal of the day. If 3 tablespoons daily feels like a lot, start with 1 and build. The dose response is real, but even the lower dose shows benefit. And something done consistently is always worth more than a larger dose done intermittently. I've talked at length in previous episodes about the gut microbiome and its relationship to immune function, mood, and vagal health. Today I want to approach it through a slightly different lens: metabolic inflammation. Here's the connection. Your gut microbiome is a primary regulator of your baseline systemic inflammation. The composition of your gut bacteria, which species are dominant, which are sparse, directly influences how much inflammatory signaling your body is running at any given time. Certain bacterial species, when they have access to the fiber and polyphenols they thrive on, produce short-chain fatty acids that actively reduce systemic inflammation. Other bacterial species, The ones that tend to dominate in low-fiber, high-processed food diets produce compounds that increase it. And remember what we established at the start of today's episode. Chronic, low-grade systemic inflammation is what allows visceral fat to thrive. It's the environment visceral fat requires to persist and to do its damage. Reduce the baseline inflammation, and you fundamentally change the metabolic conditions in which visceral fat is operating. So the microbiome strategy for visceral fat isn't just about satiety, though that's part of it. It's about using gut-friendly foods to lower the inflammatory baseline that allows visceral fat to maintain its foothold. The specific foods with the strongest evidence here are legumes, chickpeas, lentils, black beans, kidney beans. These are extraordinarily fiber-dense. They contain both soluble and insoluble fiber, and they are among the best-studied prebiotics, meaning they selectively feed the beneficial bacterial species we want to cultivate. There's a specific finding I love sharing with patients. A single bean-based lunch, even something as simple as a lentil soup or a bean taco, has been shown to produce a satiety effect that extends beyond the meal itself. Meaning, people who ate beans for lunch consumed measurably less food at dinner without consciously restricting. The gut bacteria, well fed on the fiber, send satiety signals through the gut-brain axis, through the vagus nerve, that persist for hours and reduce hunger at the next meal. You're not white-knuckling through hunger. The biology is doing the work for you. And the cumulative anti-inflammatory effect of regular legume consumption is well documented. Populations that eat legumes as a dietary staple, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Latin American cuisines, consistently show lower rates of the metabolic diseases associated with visceral fat, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome. This is not a coincidence. It's a microbiome effect playing out at the population level over decades. One practical tweak, if legumes aren't currently a regular part of your diet. Start small. Add half a cup of chickpeas to a salad. Make a simple lentil soup once a week. The microbiome adapts relatively quickly to new fiber sources, and the satiety and anti-inflammatory effects begin to accumulate within a few weeks of consistent intake. The final protocol I want to share today comes not from a laboratory in Cambridge or a research hospital in Iceland. It comes from Okinawa, Japan, a region that has for decades been studied by gerontologists and epidemiologists as one of the world's longest-lived populations. The principle is called hara hachi banmei. It's a cultural norm passed down through generations that translates roughly to eat until you are 80% full. Stop before you feel full. Stop at the point where you feel satisfied but not stuffed. Leave a little space. Now, I know how this sounds. It sounds like a willpower instruction, and as a clinician, I have limited patience for health advice that essentially boils down to just try harder. That's not medicine. That's not a strategy. But here's why hara hachi banmei is actually a biology lesson, not a willpower lesson. The feeling of being full, the signal that tells your brain enough, stop eating, is largely mediated by a hormone called leptin. Leptin is released by fat cells and by the gut in response to food intake, and it travels through the bloodstream to the hypothalamus, where it registers as satiety. The problem is the time delay. From the moment food arrives in your stomach, to the moment leptin is produced and released in meaningful quantities, to the moment it arrives at the hypothalamus and registers, that process takes about 15 to 20 minutes, which means that by the time your brain is receiving the I'm full signal, you may have been eating for another 15 to 20 minutes past the point of actual physiological sufficiency. If you eat fast, which most people do, especially when they're hungry, you can consume a very significant amount of excess food in that 15 to 20 minute window. By the time the leptin signal arrives, You're not 80% full. You're 115% full. You feel it. That heavy, slightly uncomfortable, regretful fullness that most of us recognize. Hara Hachi Bunmei works not because of willpower, but because it buys time for the biology. Eating slowly, stopping consciously before you reach the sensation of fullness, gives leptin time to do its job. By the time you've finished eating and set down your fork and had a glass of water, the satiety signal arrives, and you're satisfied, not stuffed, not uncomfortably full, just done. There's a practical framework for implementing this that I find genuinely useful. When you plate your food, consciously leave 2/3 of your plate as white space, or fill that space with high-fiber, low-calorie greens, leafy vegetables, cucumber, celery. The visual effect of a full plate is maintained, but the actual caloric density of what you're eating is substantially lower. And the fiber in those greens provides early satiety signals from the gut that arrive faster than leptin and help bridge the gap. Slow down. Put your fork down between bites. Have a conversation during the meal if you're eating with others. Allow the biology to catch up with the intake. The Japanese populations that practice this principle consistently, including those studied in the famous Blue Zone research on Okinawa, are not thin because of genetics or some mysterious Eastern secret. They're thin because their cultural eating practices align beautifully with the biology of satiety. They are, without necessarily framing it in clinical terms, leveraging leptin timing.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the journey.
Let me bring today together, because I want to make sure the through line is clear. 7 protocols, but one underlying philosophy. And it's this: metabolic health is not about fear. It is not about deprivation. It is about giving your biology the right signals at the right times. Visceral fat is dangerous. I've been very direct about that today because I think clarity on the stakes matters. The connection to cancer, to cardiovascular disease, to dementia, these are not theoretical risks. They are documented, replicated, clinically meaningful findings. The suitcase analogy, the gasoline on embers analogy, these aren't rhetorical flourishes. They're accurate descriptions of what happens physiologically when visceral fat accumulates beyond the body's capacity to contain it safely. But here's what I also want you to take away. Visceral fat is metabolically responsive. It is not a fixed permanent condition. It is a dynamic tissue that responds, often more quickly and more dramatically than subcutaneous fat, to the right interventions. A modest amount of omega-3s activates your thermogenic brown fat furnace. A 12-hour eating window gives your metabolic switch time to flip. 3 cups of green tea or 4 cups of coffee a day provide polyphenols that specifically act on visceral stores. A tablespoon or 3 of diluted apple cider vinegar prevents fat cell expansion. A bowl of lentil soup lowers your inflammatory baseline and reduces how much you'll eat at the next meal. And slowing down, putting your fork down, eating until 80% full, allows the biology of satiety to function as it was designed to. None of these is a dramatic sacrifice. None of them requires you to white-knuckle through hunger or feel bad about food. They are small, specific, evidence-based nudges that work with your biology rather than against it. Start with one. Just one. Tomorrow. Maybe it's the 8 p.m. kitchen closure. Maybe it's adding shrimp to your lunch. Maybe it's diluting a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar in a glass of water before dinner tonight. The metabolism is ready to switch tracks. All it needs from you is the signal. Thank you for being here today. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next episode.